Rephaim after the flood. Let's just broaden it. Giants after the flood. Was there a second wave of this? In terms of the biblical text, we're never told anything like that. As far as another period or event of cohabitation. That's one of the three options for why they're there. And in Unseen Realm, I sketch out the three explanations for how you get giant clans after the flood. And in short terms, one is you view either Noah or Noah's sons or the daughters married to those sons as somehow being a carrier, for lack of a better word. And for some ancient Jews, that was their answer, because you will find texts that say that. You'll find there's one text that describes Noah as a giant. Again, it tells you that when you find a text like that, it tells you they're thinking about the question, and so they feel like they've got to come up with some answer to it. So Noah was like fathered by one of them. Those who shall not be named. That. You'll find another text where Noah's parents are having an argument. His dad, Lamech, this is the Genesis Apocryphon. It's a very famous text. Lamech goes to his wife, who's actually given a name in the text, Bitanosh or Batanosh. Both of them mean daughter of man. But he comes to her and says, well, yeah, I heard about all this Watcher stuff going on. And I just want to make sure that this kid's mine, and they have an argument. She's like, don't you remember the other night when, so again, it tells you that they're thinking about the question. So that's one option. Another option is you view the flood not as a truly global event, but a regional event, regional or localized event. And, you can have that view and still say to the biblical writer, this was all the earth because all the nations of the earth are listed in Genesis 10. To us, that's regional, but to them it was comprehensive, whatever. But you have to somehow then have ancestors, Nephilim ancestors, survive the flood in some region of the known world. And people who take that view will usually go to the Aegean Sea, because of the Philistines. The Philistines are actually members, and we know this from Egyptian texts. The Philistines are a group of people from a larger group of people called the Sea Peoples, who were seafaring peoples from the Aegean. They come to the mainland, of not only Egypt but Canaan on boats. That's how they get there. If you've read The Portent, I go into some of this stuff, to strike a fictional trajectory about Goliath. But since Goliath was the son of Rapha, which you can say, well, that means he's a Rephaim, and he's a Philistine, and they're one of the Sea Peoples, that maybe something survived here. Jeremiah talks about the Philistines coming from Caphtor, which is one of the Aegean, islands and stuff like that. And again, people know where the Philistines came from. The third option is to take Genesis 6:1, Genesis 6:4, and translate it a little bit differently. And this is legitimate. This is possible. If you go to Genesis 6:4, I'll try not to have a grammar spasm here. But it says, the Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men and they bore children to them. Now, when there, you can take that particle, and because of the verb form that follows it, being an imperfect verb form, you can translate it this way. The Nephilim were on earth in those days and also afterward, whenever the sons of God came in to the daughters of men, they bore children to them. You'll actually see this verse referenced in Hebrew reference grammars about this particular use of the imperfect with this particle. So that's possible. Now, should we do that? Is that what it really means to say? Well, who knows, because it's a translation choice. And that's all you got. You just sort of pick one of those three, answers to the question, why we get them on the other side of the flood. And that's targeting these Rephaim, because you get Rephaim in Deuteronomy 2 and 3. It's very clear. They're described as being very tall. They're referred to as Anakim. The Anakim, according to Numbers 13, come, quote, from the Nephilim. I mean, it's point blank, what's there. So those are the paths you have to follow, to answer that question. Go ahead.
If it is the third option, do you think that would have been a second incursion by different watchers, or would that have been the first group that somehow escaped out of the abyss?
Yeah, I don't think there's any indication that the original offenders get anywhere except where they're always described as being in prison. So you would have to have the same sort of transgression of heaven and earth is what it comes down to. And there's no indication of that specifically. I mean, you could look at what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 11 about because of the angels, and you could say, well, Paul apparently thought this was a possibility. Okay, you could say that, but Paul's not making a statement that it did. It's just he's like, we just don't ever want to see this happen again. It's that kind of thing. So you could take that and say, well, for Paul, maybe it was a possibility, but it's not a real answer to the question. When do I think Genesis 1 to 11 was written? Because of the heavy Mesopotamian influence there in those 11 chapters. And could Moses have had that information? That's a short way of saying it. Well, I would never want to say that Moses couldn't have had the information. Moses is an Egyptian. He's raised in the court of Pharaoh, Akkadian during the New Kingdom, which would be the Mosaic era by either chronology, either later or older chronology. Akkadian in that period, which was the literary language of Babylonian stuff, Mesopotamian stuff, was kind of like English is today. It was the lingua franca. It was the language of international correspondence. And we know that for sure because of the Tel El Amarna letters. Okay, these are letters, it's a correspondence. I'm sure you've heard of the El Amarna letters. They're actually a correspondence between the Pharaoh of Egypt and his underlings in Canaan, the people he's put in charge. And they're written in Akkadian. They're not written in Egyptian. So we know that for sure. So if Moses, again, was being groomed to be a pharaoh or a diplomat or some other high office in the household of Pharaoh, I think it's reasonable to assume he probably had to learn Akkadian. I think that's a reasonable assumption. Again, it's still an argument from silence because we don't actually know what he read. That the question then becomes, okay, if he could read it, what is he reading? There's no evidence in Egypt that you have libraries from Mesopotamia in Egypt. You have lots of correspondence. You got lots of letters and documents and land deeds. And wouldn't that have been awful, to spend your youth, deciphering economic texts, like somebody's bill to somebody for 10 sheep, treaties, I guess, would be better. You got to learn that stuff. But so we don't really know, again, what he would have, been reading. On the other side, there's so much that is overtly polemic in Genesis 1 to 11 against Mesopotamian material that it's really next to impossible. And in fact, it would just violate what you actually see in the text to say that whoever wrote Genesis 1 through 11, or at least this part of Genesis 1 through 11, was not looking at a Mesopotamian text specifically to respond to things in that text. Because it's more than like deity names and stuff like that. It's even grammar in some places where they want the literate person to know what they are tracking on and what they're objecting to, how they are subverting the Mesopotamian material that they assume the reader knows. It gets very detailed. So there are places you just have to have that in front of you, unless I guess you memorized cuneiform or something. I mean, again, that's possible. There were people who did that. So it's a back and forth, for me. I think the more reasonable explanation is that Genesis 1 through 11 or what was either composed or edited during the exile with this strategy in mind. But I won't say that it's impossible that Moses, could have known that and had access to the material. We don't see a path, but that doesn't mean there wasn't one. So